I'm Michael Johnson and will serve as the moderator of today's session. We again thank you for taking time out of your weekend to join us. The next conversation session will be on Sunday, December 5th at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. Our conversation partner will be Marianne Moyart, Professor of Religion and Theology at the Free University of Amsterdam. Marianne will be speaking on critical interfaith pedagogy, quote, drawing upon Ricoeur's hermeneutical anthropology and taking into account patterns of prejudice, power, and privilege, unquote. More information and registration are available on the project website, which, as you likely all know, is www.hinrl.org. Also on the site, we have a Contact Us link where we welcome suggestions about the site and the project, and also suggestions for future speakers. So for today, we are really pleased to have as our speaker, John Arthos, who will discuss with us how hermeneutics can be placed at the center of undergrad instruction in the basic competencies of writing and speaking. The title of his discussion today is Rhetoric, Hermeneutics, and General Education. John is author of 4 monographs and 50 journal essays on hermeneutics and rhetoric, a longtime participant in the Society for Ricoeur Studies and the North American Society of Philosophical Hermeneutics, and director of the basic public speaking course at Indiana University, Bloomington, where he is an associate professor in the Department of English. John also serves as a current board member of the Society for Ricoeur Studies. John will speak for about 20 minutes or so, and that will be followed by Q&A and discussion for the remainder of our hour together. So participants, please feel free to submit your questions in the chat box. You may start typing your questions in the chat anytime, either during today's presentation or after. We are asking if you want to raise a question, please do use the chat box so that we can provide a diverse group of questions. And please do remember to mute your computers and cell phones. Also note, we will be recording this for future viewing on our website. So thank you, John, and welcome.
Thank you. And I'm going to get my screen up here. Okay. So yeah, I'm thrilled to have this chance to share some thoughts with you and to have this conversation. And I want to say up front that I'm deeply invested in this series, this speaker series, and this whole effort with hermeneutics in real life, because I do believe that hermeneutics will wither if we don't cultivate some strong institutional supports for it. So today I'm going to talk about the specific route I am taking to try to do this. And I'm going to show this in very practical terms with my undergrad teaching at my home campus. I don't teach hermeneutics as a subject matter. I don't teach being in time or truth and method or fallible man, but it underlies and guides my teaching. And I should say, when Gadamer taught his basic survey course in philosophy, which he did for many years, he did the same thing. You're looking at the textbook anthology he edited with his own commentaries, and it's very clearly shaped by his hermeneutic perspective, but that's in the background. Now, hermeneutics does have a close tie to a school subject at the undergraduate level, since rhetoric has always been central to the general education. And even if it's proven vulnerable to the ebbs and flows of fashion, we'll always have to teach students about metaphor and symbol and genre and narrative. Here is a popular reference site that I recommend to you that celebrates this very rich heritage. Richard Nordquist is doing rhetoric instruction at Thought Company, which is a big player online. And his little explainers are quite sophisticated, even if he isn't quoting Ricoeur. Now, in terms of the sibling relationship of rhetoric and hermeneutics for education, the evidence is strong. I will say that hermeneutics developed organically out of rhetorical education. And it did this, it came into disciplinary existence at precisely the moment when a Renaissance humanist education, which was essentially rhetorical and prudential, bumped up against modernity, which is to say, when the combination of communication technology, the Gutenberg press, and the promotion of reading and literacy through the Reformation shifted the focus of learning from the spoken to the written word, and interpretation, through the recognition of cultural pluralism and historical relativism, became an animating concern for the humanities. So before I get to the teaching examples, I'm going to give you a condensed 2-minute version of this transition that I'm mentioning here, because it's what gives me my definition of hermeneutics. And my starting point is that, unlike the conventional view inherited from the 19th century, that rhetoric is the productive art and hermeneutics is the interpretive art, the two, as a kind of tag team in a kind of horizontal reciprocity, I see hermeneutics as the theoretical dimension of a rhetorical practice, and one that steers rhetoric away from its more debased forms. So seeing things in this way is not unrelated to hermeneutics' more abstruse ontological substructure that's developed in the books I've just mentioned. The predicate forms you're looking at here are all taken from Gadamer, and they describe what I will call an orientation, which is what guides my approach to a rhetorical education, and which I explain in the following way. So classical rhetoric, as we know, has many forms and many identities: persuasion, sophistry, public argument, a theory of figures. The hermeneutic sense of rhetoric, and I'm going to go into the weeds here for a minute, takes its form from the old Protestant idea of the word as it took shape beginning in the 16th century, which in effect radicalizes the already radical anti-dualism of incarnation, the word unfolding through history, the word embodied in different forms. When it engages in this act of political revolt from church hierarchy and teaches the priesthood of all believers, the congregation as a democratic polity, the baptized as members of the body of the church. This was an extraordinary conception, and it was this anti-dualist and anti-hierarchical idea that fed, in what's been called Northern humanism, the seedbed for, I believe, the radical linguistic ontology of later German thought. And it's both parts of this idea that are so generative: the reciprocity of mind and matter, the anti-dualism, and the authority vested in the whole community. Okay, I hope we get to have a chance to come back to this engraving, this remarkable image. I call it the Big Pen. So when Gadamer cited Luther's assistant Philippe Melanchthon's 16th century school rhetoric curriculum as the turning point for modern hermeneutics, he, Gadamer, was pointing to something like the origin point of the linguistic turn in the 20th century, the word as history bodying forth. And I've argued that this idea is already contained in the rhetoric handbooks that Melanchthon wrote at Wittenberg. So when I show you my coursework in a minute, you'll see that provenance. All right, so this understanding of the historical word as transitive between event, text, and community becomes, in hermeneutics, the transitivity between the registers of speech, embodied, inscribed, lived. But, and here's a crucial caveat, these transitive registers don't manifest in some kind of seamless idealism. they express instead a very human and all too human struggle for communication. Ricoeur is the most eloquent about this, what he calls tragic finitude. Communication is always a struggle, is afflicted by all the frailties that attach to our human condition, as a patchwork affair that's lucky to make any progress at all. But from these two contrary pieces, the transitivity and the struggle, I get my working definition of a hermeneutic rhetoric, which I give you now. And here, our communication has to be constantly attuned to its own makeshift effects by a reflective intervention in our rhetorical practices. My teaching philosophy is that a hermeneutically trained mind or consciousness or community, these are important variants, must attempt to correct the flaws in the makeshift tools of human expression that it's devised for cheating its own finitude. So that's the very condensed background for my orientation. It's a syncretic reading of this long humanist tradition that's not original with me, and it gives tremendous scope to the many gen ed courses I teach. And the three courses you see listed here are gen eds I'm teaching now that are informed by this background. I'm going to show you one hermeneutic dimension for each course, respectively, historical, social, and then ideological. So first, the historical. I teach a course in English called Rhetoric, Law, and Culture. At IU, we have a pre-law center and an advising unit rather than a major, which means that any department can offer law-related courses. So I developed a course in the rhetoric list in which students for class role play appellate and Supreme Court cases. They perform oral arguments in a courtroom setting and then write majority or dissenting opinions for their term paper. They actually love this course. And here's the payoff for me. American case law, much more than German jurisprudence, is in effect almost exactly what Gadamer describes in Truth and Method in a section titled The Exemplary Significance of Legal Hermeneutics, in which the principle of application means that the written word of public institutions and how we live our lives converge. You can start to see the radicalism I was referring to here, because the hermeneutic approach challenges the foundationalist view of law and the logic of subsumption that derives from that, in which any conduct simply fits, like Procrustes' victims here, right, into predetermined categories. And in place of this, hermeneutics offers something very much like the precedent theory of practical judgment that grows out of the English common law tradition. And the idea here is that, and I'm showing you here the Commerce Clause from the Constitution, that because of our fallible understanding, our inability to read the future, each new case tests or challenges precedent, and so in effect instructs the law. So there's a sense in which we write our laws backwards. And a plain example of this is the Interstate Commerce Clause, how far our iterative jurisprudence has had to stretch the meaning of those 12 words in the Constitution. So now we not only pay taxes on our Amazon orders, but we have Obamacare across state lines by stretching the meaning of that clause. The Constitution couldn't anticipate the stresses that would be placed on the meaning of those words, commerce or even regulation, right? And so those words develop their meanings in the fullness of time. Likewise, the founding document didn't anticipate shifts in cultural understanding of race, gender, sexual orientation, but our understanding of how we have to read that text does. So we write our laws backwards, so to speak, in this sort of makeshift way. And gradually through this semester, I help students see this sort of reverse engineering with concepts like stare decisis and precedent theory and the whole appeals apparatus and the genres of judicial opinion. And as you see with this quote from Gadamer, we're taking effectively a hermeneutic approach to the law. Jay's here. I see Jay Moots, who was one of the founding members of the Recur Society, by the way, and he's written about all of this extensively. So I definitely have to draw on that for this course. Now, at the level of the social, so I'm on my second course. This is a 100 level required college gen ed course that I've been put in charge of, that all our students take. So 50,000 students and counting by now, from about 8 years. And everything I've been talking about converges in this gateway to the liberal arts. It's one of only 3 required courses that students have to take in the gen ed. Okay, so when I came to be the director of this program, I actually reconfigured the learning goals of what's become the nationwide sort of standard model of the basic public speaking course, which you may have taken, which in its typical form has to serve so many institutional constituencies that it often becomes this homogenized, instrumentalized, professionalized, flattened, and sort of apolitical skills course. And instead, what we do, and here I'm describing the goals of our 3 major speeches. Speech number 1 is to think ethically from the perspective of the other. Speech number 2 is to find a new commonplace for audiences that they and you as the speaker can inhabit together. And speech 3 is to transform the cultures that you and they inhabit by changing the ways we talk to each other. In the last speech of the course, the one I just mentioned to you, students stage an ideological intervention with their peers by attacking the unthought commonplaces of their conventional discourse. So for example, referring to women as women rather than girls, which begins to reconstitute the discourse of community, or refiguring a Muslim American Iraq war veteran as a patriotic American. You might remember this event, as a way to revision what this community is, or thinking about what blue and black are as cultural signifiers, that they're not equivalent, right? Which highlights the work of language in constituting community. So in these speeches, because remember, public speaking isn't a passive learning, but a form of civic engagement. Students don't just think about how their discursive filters shape their realities. They engage in a practice of reflective intervention in their own emergent identities. They interrupt each other's presuppositions and cherished beliefs, and start encountering each other's difference through their speaking with one another. Okay, so for my last example, I want to show you how an ontological implication underlies at least a critical pedagogy in this film appreciation, film theory course I'm teaching right now. So instead of just teaching film grammar in this course, I use the chance to show students how narrative constitutes us as temporal beings. And to do this, I follow Recur's identification of human time with narrative time. The idea that experience, meaning, and narrative order are all interdependent. You might know that his thesis rests on the phenomenological insight about the relation of presence and absence in human understanding, which is that we humans find whatever permanence we have by devising ways to anticipate, reflect, revise what we understand of the world with a whole repertoire of makeshift competencies. And one of these competencies, so here's one of the units in the course, is that we trade between an immediate understanding in an image and the gradual accounting for or coming to terms with some meaning in an unfolding story. So going back to my definition, our understanding seems to work across these shifting temporal modalities. The beauty of cinema, and I've found is that you can approach this transitivity from either side, from the angle of temporal becoming, sequence, right, and then, or from the side of the fullness of time. We have this here in this image of the fall of Icarus. Icarus falls while this oblivious farmer plows the field. There's an entire moral tale in this one image. As you experience a motion picture, it combines and moves between these two registers of or modes quite naturally. Now, my students who are already quite sophisticated readers of the temporal logics of film, how it subverts chronology and plays with overlapping temporal orders, uses foreshadowing and repetition to collapse time. And in the example I'm going to show you, trades back and forth between the immediate and unfolding understanding that I mentioned. So this is when my students watch a British film trilogy, 3 films called Red Riding, which develops the symbol of the swan as a recurring visual motif that stretches across the entire trilogy. So first we established that the cultural symbol of the swan figures innocence, purity, freedom, but also in its peculiar mythological ambiguity, sexual violence, domination, miscegenation, and how the film uses this ambiguity as a condensation symbol in the narrative experience. And what I show students is how the symbolic language operates in both registers, both in the story structure and in the visual design, as a device of foreshadowing, as a faceted index for the complex moral aspects of its subject, which is the working class town in Northern England, and as a summative emblem of the story's theme. The swan imagery works like a pedal point in the trilogy in the way that it develops a symbolic unity. So symbol means to gather, Heidegger reminds us about this, out of the unfolding narrative progression. And the students see this concretely when I have them log each instance of the figure across the trilogy and then interpret its different uses across the narrative. And then we talk about how the symbol as a vision gathers up and reflects the complex meanings that the story is developing. And this comes to a head in the culminating scene of the entire film trilogy. You see it here. It's the rescue of an abducted child out of a poultry slaughterhouse where she'd been secreted. It's this ecstatic scene of rebirth and redemption, and it's expressed within the figural idiom as a composite, as a fusion of this goodness and evil that the film is about. So when students see the relationship between this summative image and the complications and crises and reversals of the narrative, they understand in effect what Rousseau means when he says that a plot is a configuring operation that, and I'm quoting here, extracts a figure from a succession, right? Or in the opposite direction, condenses a succession into a figure. Which is, going back to my definition again, one makeshift way that a human understanding attempts to reconcile being and becoming. So even if it's only a first step at the undergrad level, I'm trying to give students a glimpse into the grammar of human finitude, right? Okay, so I'll draw to a conclusion now. I started by saying that human communication circulates through the ongoing attunement to and tuning of its own makeshift effects. It's not a serene, undisturbed reflection outside of a practice, right? And then I gave these 3 examples of how this makes its way into my teaching. In the case of jurisprudence, how the fixation of norms in a law is a kind of place marker backfilled by experience, as each new problem or case teaches the law what it is. And in this way, the law mimics permanence by making itself a work in progress. In the case of civic speech, how publics seek to fashion community by finding common cause in common places, mimicking something like what Kenneth Burke calls consubstantiality, or how it intervenes consciously in the language we use to construct our own realities. And in the case of narrative design, the third course, how an audience reaches an understanding of life's meaning gradually through complication, crisis, revelation, right, narrative, or all at once in the glance of an eye. And in this double vision, sequential and immediate, mimics something like comprehension. So that's a taste of how I draw on the historical collaboration of these two liberal arts. I've certainly risked giving you too much and too little here. So yeah, it'll be great if we could continue to draw these threads out a little bit more. I'll stop my slide presentation here.
Well, thank you, John. And let's all thank John for a stimulating and very wide-ranging talk. We have questions already appearing in chat. If you could please type your questions in chat so we can kind of queue things up here. It looks like we have a couple of questions already. The first one is from Shame. I might be mispronouncing your name. If you could please, if you'd like to read your question and speak it to John whenever you are ready.
Yeah, you had been talking earlier about the sibling relationship between rhetoric and hermeneutics, and articulated that hermeneutics is the theoretical basis that can guide a rhetorical practice and guides rhetoric away from, I think you said, its debased forms, and I forget what the precise noun was. I was just wondering if you could explain more what you mean by that.
Yeah. So one way, not the way, but one way, its debased forms being the kinds that we know in public, the bad reputation it has in public. So for example, when a politician says, that's just rhetoric, right? So that's what I meant by debased forms, the stereotypes of rhetorics that got started with Plato, right? When he made fun of the sophists, that we've been trying to recover from for 2 millennia. And that rhetoric does often, I mean, obviously, right? So Renaissance humanism, for example, is based upon this glorious tradition of rhetoric that I'm a part of, that you're a part of. So is that clear? Clear what I mean? I offered some definitions of rhetoric. So I didn't mean those definitions to be debased, debased forms. I mean specifically the ways in which rhetoric has been debased in the cultural imagination, that we all have to work to correct, or be honest about too, because of course rhetoric does have, right, the capacity, and that's in this course that I'm teaching, right? With the very first lecture in the course is rhetoric is a great power loosed, because rhetoric has this potential to do great evil and to be itself evil, right? It's a power that can do great harm or great good. So one of the great questions we ask in the course is, right, how does rhetoric save itself from its worst self?
Okay, thank you, John. We'll move on to the next question here. We have one from Jay Moots. Jay, if you'd like to read or speak your question for John.
Sure. Hi, John. I have a question about the pedagogy that you raised, and it's something I find difficult when teaching law students. It seems like it's hard to know how without knowing that, and I wondered about the blend you have to bring, because I sometimes think all I teach my law students is rhetoric and hermeneutics. They just don't know it. And I wonder, in your experience with undergraduates, how much do you need to get to the know that to help them to even better reflect on the attunement of what they're doing? Or do you just try to stimulate the the effects and say it's too much to try to add in the know that as well.
Yeah, so that's Jay. Thanks for that is always the challenge, right? And more so. And I'm actually going to ask some of the folks in this Zoom call are actually teaching 155 now, so I'll ask them to chime in here. So when we set up the curriculum for that course, the state actually, because we have shared courses that you can transfer in, it requires us to adopt a set of learning goals that are common to all of the the courses that are equivalents, right? And so most of those learning goals are skills goals. So I have to make sure that the students in this course get those skills. And so for me, it's a both and. It's making sure that they know how to speak extemp, that they can compose an argument effectively, that they can bring pathos to their speaking, all of the standard skills, that they know how to create a warrant, right, for an argument and use evidence, and yet bring a living speech to the communities that they're trying to build. So all of those things have to be there. And then it's this more ambitious thing that we're trying to do, is to move beyond that. And I think you just try the best you can. I mean, the way we think about it is that we plant seeds. I'd actually like to ask, you know, the both classes. So grad students from 155, if you guys want to, if any of you want to pipe in on that tension that Jay's talking about. And also I see Zach and Alexis, you're in the film course now. Maybe if you see how, whether you think the film is different from a standard film, standard film course. Okay, so either of you, any of you.
Just go ahead and unmute your microphones or raise your hand. Zach, yeah.
Yeah, so I was going to say, a film course is a little bit different than a regular literature course. I'm taking two other just straight literature courses. So there's a lot more attention placed on the language of words in literary courses, where naturally in film courses, there's a lot more importance placed on image and the symbolism of image. So I think that's really the most obvious difference between the two.
Yeah.
Good. Anyone else? Alexis?
Yeah, I'm taking a different type of film course as well currently, and I wholeheartedly agree with Zach. I feel like with those courses, there's a lot of focus on the type of, like, how they're actually filming and how they're creating the film, whereas in our visual rhetoric class, we talk a lot more about symbolic things, meanings of things, and how those two connect, where I feel like that my other course doesn't really make that connection as much.
Thank you, Zach and Alexis. John, should we move on to the next question here? Yes, we have one from Jason Michalik. If you want to go ahead, it looks like you have two questions. Would you like to try to start with one and we can maybe come back for the second one? Jason, if you can read or speak your question.
Yeah, thanks. So I was trying to form a through line because I only have experience in teaching P155, but right from the beginning, I was seeing kind of a thread in terms of thinking about contingency. And so I'm thinking more of the Aristotelian contingency of nomos. I'm not as familiar with, I haven't read Gadamer directly, but I was wondering what tensions you've encountered in teaching and trying to engage students in dialogue. First in the law course, thinking about the contingency of laws and logics that guide them. And so that's kind of jamming them out of how laws are differentiated from logics. But then how that functions similarly or differently through the final unit of P155, which is transformation, right? Rethinking a container like a commonplace, And then in the film course, I like the language you used about unfolding and collapse, right, which is a fluctuation of contingency. And so I wondered, just are there unique opportunities in talking through them?
Yeah. So thanks for that, Jason. Yeah. So let me talk about it in terms of the law versus the speech course. What is so obvious? So the law course is taken mostly by seniors, right, and juniors, and so they're much more able to handle this relationship that Gadamer talks about between the general and the particular. How the historically embedded instance that sort of comes to challenge the law, right? They're really comfortable understanding that, how that's gradually and always modifying our understanding of any given law, right? So they're comfortable with that. I don't find resistance there at all. You do occasionally, as you guys know, Jason and Phil, you will occasionally get resistance from the freshmen, the first year students, right? Because they come out of environments, this is the state of Indiana, right? Red state Indiana, where these notions of the right handed down by, right, it is so firmly in and they're teachers, who teach public speaking in a certain way. So it's harder for them, right? It's a little bit harder for them to adjust to this what I call at the beginning of the talk, radical, right? Quite radical. What we're doing is, in a sense, quite radical instruction.
Thank you, John. We have a question or comment here from Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey, if you'd like to speak your question or comment for John to respond to. Yeah.
My question, I think, dovetails with the radicalness of your last statement. In my work with students of contemporary psychoanalysis, there's a strong movement raising Gadamer to the level of the organizing principle of new psychoanalysis, which is the prejudice of the listener prevents the listener from understanding the patient, and that the organizing principle of the therapeutic action is now misunderstanding, not understanding, called enactment, which removes the struggle to understand from the student's point of view, almost normalizing what would be called a treatment failure. And so this muddle is spinning around the students' heads, and I was wondering on your thoughts about that.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I'm not familiar with this. I'm thinking about this, though, in terms of the humanities, because I'm going to be teaching a grad seminar next in the spring called The Character of the Humanities. And so I'm trying to understand. And that one of the questions that I'm asking is, what is it that distinguishes a humanities approach to a subject matter from a social science or a science approach? We have to respect the important contributions of all these different ways of thinking, but we also have to know how they're different. So what is it, for instance, that distinguishes a course in sort of environmental humanities from a course in environmental science, right? And I think that hermeneutics really tries to think deeply about that question, right? About how human beings struggle with problems that are contingent, right? That are complex. And so I guess I want to say that, to me, more than anything else, this is a question I haven't answered yet, that I'm really struggling with myself, right? What is it that is distinctive about the ways that we as human beings engaging with these most difficult problems of all that a humanities education confronts you with, about death and suffering and what we're doing to the world.
Okay, thank you, John. Let's move on to the next question. This one's by Stephen Mayu. If you would like to read or speak your question for John.
Hi, John. I'll modify the question a bit in light of what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
What rhetorical and hermeneutic resources pedagogically do you have when the students have really radically different or radically opposed political views, where, for example, you could talk somewhat effectively about what were the last three topics you said? Death and suffering on the one hand, where the political differences might not make a difference, but talking about climate or climate change, they might make a big difference if the students come from a conservative or right perspective, denying that's that big of a problem, whereas students from the left might be saying, yes, this is our biggest problem. So I was wondering if you could just maybe address that kind of problem.
Right. So that is something that we face all the time in the public speaking class, because the students get to pick their own topics for their speeches, right? So abortion, guns, right? Anything, right? And here's the remarkable thing. I'm going to tell you how we do this, right? But the remarkable thing is that we've been doing this for 8 years and we haven't had a major problem. We're sitting in Red State, Indiana, and students are grasping or talking with each other about all of these problems. And we have not had any issue that is blown up politically, right? Knock on wood. But it's because I think it's because of the pedagogy that I developed for the course, which is based on, it's actually, it comes out of practical, it comes out of, prudential, phronesis teaching, right? And what we do is, in the second speech of the invitational speech of the course, we have students think about anchoring their appeals to their audiences first in common places that are shared. So they first have to locate common places that are common to them and their audiences, those who are opposed to them, right, of their peers, right? And then they try to move their audience from that shared commonplace to a new commonplace, right? So they try to discover a warrant that will help everyone in that community to move from the shared commonplace to a commonplace that might feel either unfamiliar or frightening or dangerous, right? And the instructor works with them in the process of developing that speech, in locating those common places. And what we find is that by going through that process, what will happen is, because they ask their peers as well, their peers sort of chime in as they're developing their speeches, the students often modify not only their arguments, but their positions in the process of doing that, right? So there's this marvelous thing that happens. The community is actually transformed in the process of speaking and listening. So it really works. And this is this old ancient idea, this old rhetorical idea of the commonplace.
Okay, thank you, John. We have a comment here from Shane. If you'd like to, looks like a follow-up from your previous question here. And then I would invite others to either type your questions in to chat, or you can raise your hand. We'll prioritize chat, but go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Shane, if you'd like to go ahead.
It's Chaim.
Chaim, yeah.
Yeah. I was just responding to Professor Mayu's comment. I don't think I need to, John said it. I don't think I need to reiterate it at length.
Thank you, Chaim. So we have a question from Adrian. If you'd like to go ahead and unmute your microphone and speak your question.
Sure. Thank you. First of all, thank you for your very interesting presentation. So I was wondering, do you actually mention any hermeneutic theorists in class? And how do your students respond to this? Do you discuss their theories, for example? Do you discuss Gadam or Heidegger or Ricoeur or whatever?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't shy away from it or try to hide it. But you know, I think this is a developmental issue, right? Students aren't ready to hear the word rhetoric, frankly, right? When they first come here, right? And so what we try to do is we try to interest them in these subject matters and these approaches and things like that. And then, you know, by the by, you know, if they'd like to know, I think I got Zach interested in hermeneutics a little bit. Would you say so, Zach?
I would, yeah, I would. Rhetoric isn't often taught in high schools in Indiana. I haven't been a return student currently, former student, high school student in Indiana. So a lot of these concepts would be new to incoming freshmen and people who are developing interest.
Yeah, that's kind. So, Adrian, that's kind of the strategy that I use. And as I say, wherever these opportunities happen, but I definitely don't try to push it on people but there's always this tension, that the one that I think that Jay was referring to, right? That rather than the how, that there's only so much that you can do and you just do the best you can. And as I say, this metaphor of planting seeds, I think, is the one that we most often use. But you can't teach students all of this stuff all at once, but you can plant some seeds.
Okay, so we have time for a few more questions. Go ahead and either raise your hand or type in chat. I could fill in here with a question for John. You know, so recently in critical theory, there is what is often sometimes called the effective turn, right? And increasingly, our students are, we want to include more of this kind of effective dimension of thinking about these kinds of issues, especially general education. And hermeneutics often has the I don't know, reputation, but being very focused on text. But on the other hand, you're talking about rhetoric, which has this dimension of moving people through connecting to them. I'm wondering how maybe two parts of the question. Is that something you see kind of built into your kind of model, your transitivity here? And secondly, is this something that you pay attention to more in one of your classes versus the other? I'm thinking like the film class, this would really come out much more. And in Ricoeur, he often, when he's talking about rhetoric, focuses more on the commonplaces, the habitual ways of moving people to action, versus poetics is much more the idea of, breaking open these kinds of habitual ways of seeing things. So I'm wondering, it's kind of a twofold question. Is it already built into what you're talking about? And secondly, do you do that more in one class versus the other, if that makes sense?
Right. So yeah, I think Ricoeur sort of tries to re-regionalize rhetoric as a discipline, at least in one of his essays. But so I always think of Ricoeur's contributions to rhetoric in the broader sense of discourse, because then everything that he brings in about flesh and body, and suffering, all of that comes in. And so I think, yeah, hermeneutics, hermeneutics seems to me to be beautifully positioned to speak to the affective turn, because it's this notion of embodiment. Yeah, you pointed directly to this notion of the word, right? The word is not this mental cognitive operation exclusively. And of course, rhetoric, ethos, pathos, and logos. So that is something we struggle with, not with our early students, but sometimes faculty across the disciplines that sort of see things more in a cognitive or an analytic way, maybe even in the philosophy department and so forth. So there's that going on. And then if I could jump in, because I see David has a question about if even the course is a place for second order reflection on rhetoric as rhetoric. And I would say absolutely. And the thing that I'm most proud of in the 100 level course that I talk to you about the public speaking course is that fourth speech, the transformational speech. And it's another reason why that speech doesn't get into a whole lot of trouble, is because we do this second order. It's really a second order activity. They're doing a kind of, if you will, ideology critique when they look at the language that they're using when they talk with each other about a subject. It's really hard to get students to move away from the subject matter itself, the controversy, to the way that they talk about the controversy. Because at that level, they're not yet developmentally, habituated to think about the ways they're talking about it, right? So that's a second order. That whole speech is a second order assignment where they're asked to think about and intervene in the ways they talk about the things that matter to them.
Thank you, John, for that. David, did that get to the question? Did you want to follow up and respond to that, or is that kind of the question you had in mind?
Let's follow it up a little bit. I see that part. I probably have in mind more also a critical perspective on rhetoric. I think where we agree is a kind of subsuming rhetoric under a more general discussion about discourse, in that Ricoeurian sense of how do we say something to somebody about something. But the philosophical critique of rhetoric is always the great danger that it reduces everything to rhetoric. And the same might be brought against hermeneutics. And I wonder if it's possible at some point to begin to introduce those questions to your students.
So, David, when you talk about a critical hermeneutics, what can you say what you're thinking about when you say that, when you use that phrase?
Crudely put, it would be a hermeneutics with a transcendental foundation of some sort. That itself could be hermeneutical. I suppose for hermeneutics, the way I would understand contemporary hermeneutics, it has a transcendental perspective, but keeps it within hermeneutics,
right,
without making absolute claims.
Right.
I don't know what the parallel exactly on rhetoric is. I wrote myself a little side here. That if we subsume rhetoric, talk about rhetoric into talk about discourse,
right?
One of the things that hermeneutics brings in, and rhetoric can address, is a recognition that there are different forms of discourse.
Mm-hmm.
And already a kind of borderline point would be that the form itself has a rhetoric,
right?
Narrative, religious, proclamation, the old classical distinction between persuasive and celebratory rhetoric. But each instantiation of the form also has a rhetoric. And it's possible to get some distance on both of those and talk about them.
Yeah. So this is one of the great questions, right? Yeah, the distance and belonging. We are always inside the text, the linguistic turn as a whole, right? And the challenge to the linguistic turn of materialists who want to see how is it that we can get outside of the discourses that we inhabit, right? This is one of the great questions. And the way I started to get at that in my last book on where I really believe that Ricoeur makes advances on Gadamer and Heidegger is pushing in the direction of social justice, which I think is impinging more on the material, and it's actually taking Gadamer's notion of the social, right, of social reason, and pushing it harder. And so in rhetoric studies, I think the place that's happening, and it's a very exciting time to be in rhetoric studies now, right, because there's this materialist turn, which is like turning away from linguistic turn, right? And I think the way that exists in rhetoric proper is with the notion of the dissoi logoi or controversia in the Ciceronian tradition, where you have, or in public sphere theory, where this notion of the counter public sphere arises, right? So you have, you actually have people outside of a normative discourse, a dominant discourse, challenging, interrupting the frames that are hegemonic. So I think that sort of hermeneutics does have to move further and further in these directions, right, of understanding the claims of not just linguistic difference, but material difference.
Okay, we're getting close to the end of the hour, but we have a couple of comments here that are questions that may be more comments. One, maybe addressing this critical distance aspect of the conversation that's going on right now. So the first one is by Jason. Jason, did you want to read your comment or ask your question? So it sounds like we're not hearing Jason. I'll go ahead and just read it. Actually, this was looks like it was a private chat. So this is my mistake as a moderator. We'll move on to Jay. Moots, you have a comment to everyone.
I was just going to say it's the old problem of students wanting a method, it seems to me, and just a little vignette. I'm teaching 6 hours of legal argumentation to some law students in Poland in a few months. And they changed the title of my talk from legal argumentation to legal argumentation made easy, exclamation point. And I guess, so I just want to compliment you, John. It's hard to tell someone there's no method. And then they say, well, what do I do? So you have to throw them in the swimming pool a bit. And then explain, now there's no method and here's how you do it. So I just wanted to reflect on that whole question of method is probably at the root of a lot of the student experience.
Yeah, so I was thinking about Hal in 2001, right? So these robots that are automatically going to solve all our problems for us. And but rhetoric has ingenium, right? It has this sort of, but I think connecting this to the previous question, right? Sort of this insight that hermeneutics wants to talk about. I think we have to socialize that even further, right? Because it's not the insight of a human being in their own subjective interiority that comes to a better understanding. It is communities and people outside of communities who are challenging each other to think differently that is going to push the boundaries, break up the norm. And so I think that again, I think that that's what I've tried to instantiate in the assignments of the public speaking course.
Okay, we are at the 1 hour mark, and we have kind of had a promise to our conversation partners to keep these conversation sessions to 1 hour, especially on the weekend. So let's give a round of applause to John for a very fascinating discussion and highly informative. Everyone, thank you for joining us. Let's see here. As a reminder, the next conversation session will be with Marianne Moyert on Sunday, December 5th at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. So more information is already available on the project website, where registration should now be available. So you can already register if you'd like to join us for that next session. Again, thank you, everyone. We'll end the session there and end the